Inside Out. So there were about half the people tonight weren't able to see it before tonight. What'd you think? It took a little bit more than usual to figure out anything to say about this movie because there's been a lot said. There's psychology articles written about the kind of how the movie measures up against psychology realities. There's several websites where philosophers are talking about it. Obviously, the creators in the commentary talk about how they had a lot of conversations and actually went and talked to neuroscientists about various aspects because they wanted to get something close to reality. And of course, there are a lot of movie critics. So there was a lot more than the usual film to sift. And so dealing with in a world where a character is facing life getting more emotionally complex and two emotions get sucked out of her head, there's two things I want to make sure we don't do. We want to suck a couple things out right now. There's two pitfalls when we look at this film that we can fall into. The first one is thinking of yourself completely in terms of one of the emotions and then looking out at your cast of friends and acquaintances and students and family and all of those things, because the emotions represent all people. As all those great little splashes at the end tell us, everybody has all of those. And the emotions represent all people. And so there's that fear where you leave and, growing up in high school, I was kind of the emo kid. Oh, it's like I hated those joy guys. And, the disgust people. I had some of the disgust. Maybe I was disgust. Maybe I really wasn't sadness. I'm not sure. Right, it's too easy to make those caricatures out of these relationships. The idea is it's an internal struggle, and all of those are in your head. All of those being 5 emotions, which is totally all the emotions we have, right? So we don't want to stereotype those around us by pigeonholing them just to completely as one of the 5 characters. We also need to be careful when we dive inside the head that just like personality profiles and other things, we don't run with this movie to the point of thinking that it's so perfect. Like, as 38 Special would tell us, hold on loosely. Applying it to definitively in psychological terms, they actually originally had far more emotions. They had optimism, ennui, they had all sorts of different characters, and of course, because it's a kids' film, they boiled it down. They left out a lot of the complexity of our emotions. There's also some good questions, which some critics and people have pointed out. Are we ruled by our emotions, or are we truly completely ruled by our memories? Is perceptual reality that all we have to go on? Is it okay for mom to let her mind maintain a Brazilian helicopter fantasy pilot? Is it fair that dad's central representative is anger? I mean, there's a lot of those things you can find if you sift and read, and have at it if you love the film and want to explore more of that. Those aren't the discussions we're going to focus on, but there's good, interesting critiques and guards against some of us. We run with these things and we start incorporating this as if the way it's all really works. But it is about growth and emotional maturity and the need to grow up, to mature, to understand and balance joy and sadness, which is really the crux. Joy is kind of the protagonist, but right alongside her, there's kind of 2 as we learn. And we see that joy is basically running with a life course where I can't function unless it's all joy. Right? Sadness is not her favorite person to deal with at the very beginning. She doesn't even think she has a use at all. Can't function unless I have joy. I can't be She can't be emotionally functional. She thinks she's literally dragging around sadness. I have to avoid things unless it creates memories that are happy. Right? That's where she's at. Joy is deathly afraid, and that worst thing, it's like a sad core memory. That cannot be. What is it she says when she calls it at the night, when she says she's going to take over the dream running and sends everybody off? She says, all right, good night, team what? Team happy. Team happy. Good night, team happy. That's our goal. And so then, obviously, that's not really working because sadness isn't being properly incorporated. Things kind of go awry. Things escalate. Joy and sadness are removed and ejected, and then things get totally crazy. In fact, from the plot synopsis, this quote is about the film itself. It says, then at that point in the film, when we lose joy and sadness, anger, disgust, and fear attempt to maintain Riley's emotional state, but inadvertently distance Riley from her parents, friends, and hobbies, resulting in her islands slowly crumbling. who aren't able to engage the world with that healthy understanding of joy and sadness, this is what the film says happens. We won't have healthy function. And in the end, we see that Riley's memories are going to be more complex. They're going to be blends. They're not just happy, and that's okay. There are those mixed colors that goes on. You're going to have some sad core memories, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be debilitating. But Joy has kind of refusing to accept that. And so sadness doesn't have a job description, and she's doing the wrong things, and there's something amiss. And so there's that idea, and the film is putting forward that we need to be able to engage the day with joy, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear, not only when it's happy. One reviewer said, by the time Joy and sadness finally make it back to headquarters, Joy has learned to see that she and sadness are more closely intertwined than she ever would have thought possible, that joy which overlooks sadness is vapid and fleeting, and sadness without joy is also then despair. Joy wants to avoid all the situations that might have those frustrations, and what we find out is that's going to lead to a complete shutdown. Right? And that's where we find ourselves, and that's the conflict of the peace. And even though now, and it's counter, we see sadness has to step in and actually have a part in the end, sort of given that control and actually bring some healing to the situation. But yet she, at the same time, would never have found the solution if Joy hadn't been dragging her around earlier in part of the story as well. There's the balance. She'd still be laying face down outside long-term memory, right? And so, predominantly, as the creators were talking, in their minds, Joy is the protagonist, and conflict is the conflict that we face in this story is that she has to learn some things. Life is not about control. Life is not avoidance of sadness or less than joyful situations. That's accepting there's going to be a mix of emotions in each memory made, and it's okay to have those sad memories. Meanwhile, as one reviewer said, the movie suddenly made the distinction between depression and sadness, also key. Riley starts to fall apart due to the absence of both joy and sadness. When the darkness starts to sweep across that control panel, it's a metaphor for depression, as well as when they says, if we can't get back to headquarters, she won't be able to feel anything. That depression is a lack of emotion rather than too much sadness. I don't know, personally, I look back on my life, it's really easy to get upset about some core memories that are sad. A lot of the time, that's actually my own oversimplification too. If I take a closer look, they're more like the memories that we see at the end. They're multi-hued. I can focus on, there's sadness in there, there's blue stuff. Right? But there's a mixture. And actually, that sadness sometimes is the nostalgia. Sadness of things that are long past. Things or people that I miss. But inadvertently, as the synopsis said, joy and sadness aren't being dealt with, thrown out in a very cartoony kind of way, and that anger, disgust, and fear attempt to maintain the state totally screw it up, distanced from parents, friends, everything, all of our islands are crumbled, and then, as the synopsis points out, anger's actions have then disabled the control console, rendering Riley depressed and apathetic, and his rational decision is what? Run away. Run away from home. Anger convinces Riley to run away, and she sees it as very, very reasonable when it's anything but. We can rationalize a lot of things. And that's why sometimes our own minds are not trustworthy. Whoever trusted in his own mind, Proverbs says, is a fool, but he who walks in wisdom will be delivered. Where do we get the wisdom from? That's the big question, right? If our emotions can be corrupted and distorted, ejected and screwed up and faulty, and trains of thought are being derailed. Right? It's not something the movie goes into deeply, but we all know, particularly the parents in the room, if they're not careful, joy can get distorted in a child to where they like to hurt small animals. Joys can get flipped toward things that they shouldn't be. Disgust can start going toward people who are kind. These things can get completely turned topsy-turvy, and emotions can get bent. And so they don't deal with that. The film doesn't have time to deal with then how we deal with virtues of dealing with those aspects, the virtues of self-control, self-discipline. It doesn't go into that because it's only 90 minutes. Job 38:36 would say, who has put wisdom in the inward parts or given understanding to the mind? Where do we get this wisdom and discernment? Are our internal perceptions all we have to go on? The movie doesn't show us much more than that, of course. But the narrative actually cheats just a little bit. The narrative cheats. It uses some, and the creators are honest about that. They talk about that a little bit too. Because it takes the struggle of joy and sadness to put things right, but it also takes a sacrifice to get there. It takes a sacrifice. One character has to sacrifice their existence to get there. And no, it's not the imaginary boyfriend from Canada that would die for Riley, right? Actually, a bunch of them do too, but they're peripheral. As that kind of Twilight boy should be. No, who is it? Bing bong, bing bong. Right. Joy's control doesn't work. Sadness is also then powerless. She's not in a place where she can address it. Joy's down in the pit. Everything's kind of going wrong. And it takes the imaginary friend, which you can say is a metaphor for growing up. That's what they talk about. It's a metaphor for growing up. Most of us, anybody still have their imaginary friends? I don't know. Aha! Come up here and tell us about it. No. Put you on a couch later with somebody sitting in a chair. You can tell him. Right? There's something willful and not quite narratively. Like, in a story where you had to leave your imaginary friend behind, that would need to be something more decisive where the character leaves behind the imaginary friend. It doesn't really fit a psychological profile for the imaginary friend by its own willpower to willfully separate himself from you and sacrifice himself. That's kind of converse. So it's a narrative cheat. It's what we call sometimes in writing a deus ex machina. You kind of have the little extra thing come in. It doesn't fit psychological profiles, but you have this imaginary friend who fades. And he's been perpetuating his own existence, remember? It's not like he wants to die. But he lays down his life so Riley can be made whole. Philippians 2:8 says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who emptied himself by taking the form of a servant to the point of death. Right, the Christian story is that someone miraculous, by the way, not imaginary, but miraculous, does this in the true narrative of our lives. The director actually says this of the scene. He says, Bing Bong's sacrifice is what gets joy back up there. He says, when they came to this moment in the storytelling and they were putting the film and the screenplay together, this was when it felt like everything kind of came together at the perfect, it's his favorite moment in the film, the director himself. He says, this is when it all comes together for him. Bing Bong's sacrifice is what gets joy back up there. And at that point, really, though we don't necessarily know how, there's going to be a little more chaos. This is when we know Riley is going to be okay. And so although it's all in one mind, we have a familiar narrative. And that's the idea of sacrifice for the well-being of others. Now, most of us aren't asked to fade from existence. But how do we sacrifice for the well-being of others? Sometimes it's time, resources. Sometimes it's our emotional preferences. Sometimes Catherine wants to watch a romantic comedy. It's just... Actually, I'm married right. She's not that into it. But there's a trend today. All you got to do is hang out on Facebook for a while. It says we shouldn't sacrifice. Don't sacrifice your emotional well-being for others. It's probably not wise, and I think the narrative's correct, that it's not wise to generally expect deep, complex, emotional sacrifice from an 11-year-old. But I know, because I even know some of the parents in this room, that there's many a parent who has smiled through their pain for the sake of a child. You flip it around and ask that of somebody who's grown emotionally more mature, that's needed sometimes. Dad can sacrifice for the inner life of his daughter. In fact, that's probably how it should have been. We see him going from missing pieces of her life, although we only get a fraction, little glimpses, to then he's going to be at every game, right? There's there is some changes and sacrifice. Maybe that's going to slow down the course of his business. Maybe he's making some choices. We don't really get into the specifics of Dad. But a sacrifice, who should really be able to make the mature emotional sacrifice there? Probably not the 11-year-old. Probably a little more on Dad. And that's what we see that they do when they come together with some empathy. And they sacrifice. They hug their little girl. They share with her. They don't dive down. We don't see them. We see them validate her sadness. And they talk about the things they miss too. They don't dive into validating anger, disgust, or fear. There'd be some potential dangers there. The film doesn't go there. But beyond the parents at the core, then we come back to what the director says is really his moment. And that's when a friend sacrifices in the ultimate way so that Riley can be renewed. And that's kind of one of those things where if I wanted to muse, one of the questions is that my answer? Well, it's not. Is our only hope imaginary? Is our only hope potentially a construct in our own minds? Is the best we can hope for is that some deeply buried imaginary friend in my own head will make some sacrifice for me to have emotional well-being? When the director said they tested this scene, in fact, people actually said, isn't there some way to bring Bing Bong back? Like everybody, it's like, really? Like that's the way you're going to leave the story? All the test and focus groups and some of the producers, really? You want to? That's it? The answer from the director was, well, childhood can't come back, so he has to die. And I guess my answer is, really? There are some kids here tonight. There's also what we like to call children of all ages. And there's a lot of people who enjoy Pixar and Disney films who aren't preteen. This character isn't alone, by the way. Does this character have to never come back in this narrative framework? Do we have to lose all things childlike? No. Spoiler. Let's just take two examples of some other recent kids' films. One, Baymax, the other, Ralph. They both find themselves as characters in a narrative where there's another protagonist, whether it's Baymax's charge that he's caring for, whether that's Penelope von Schweetz. But they make the self-sacrifice play, both of these characters, in one scene. And in one, even though the character makes the sacrifice play, fully willing to lay down his life, there's a rescue, and that character isn't taken out. In another one, the character does lay down their life, but because of the nature of who he is, to be reconstructed or resurrected. And so those are the questions, right? Is the Savior in this story, as applied to maybe some real life, are the Saviors that we hope for only in our minds? Are they imaginary? Do we need fictions like this to spur us on because there isn't a real? And is the only way to move on and emotionally mature the end of childhood? I expected another no from that. Sorry. You missed your cue. I think the reason adults are drawn to these kinds of stories with their children is because part of us hopes something of that doesn't have to die. And the reason we react like we do to Bing Bong is because part of us hopes that the one who saves us is not gone forever. The story of Christ, the story of the gospel, is one where our friend gives his life but overcomes death. The story of the gospel is one where we're told that we need to retain something childlike. And yet, at the same time, there is a need for maturity. Right? That verse that talks about Christ laying down his life, it begins with, have this mind among yourselves. The mind of Christ is a servant mind, a sacrificial mind. And this is a story of conflict, right? Riley has conflict, her parents have conflict, Riley's mind has conflict, joy and sadness face different forms of trials. So we can love a story like this, but then when we leave and get in our cars and go home, we don't want trials we don't want those trials. We don't want those trials in our own life. And yet James 1:2 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." You know, for 40 years I had a hard time with that verse. It was actually watching this movie and then looking that up and studying it a little bit more that kind of brought me over the edge. Because the key word is count. The key word is count, and if you actually look at the root words in the translations, it can be translated as reckon or regard or count. It's an accounting issue. It's not pretending that you're joyful in the moment. It's not faking it. It's not persisting. It's not keeping that smile, but it's having regard and reckoning the greater joy, counting it toward a joy yet to come. Today doesn't feel like joy, but I'm going to count it toward that joy that I know that I have that endures forever because somebody sacrificed for me. It's not about being on team happy today. It's about counting it toward that joy that is promised, toward a better joy than that imminent joy that Joy is scrambling for at the beginning of the movie. And so we can engage situations that bring a mixture of fear, that bring disgust, that bring anger and sadness. We can engage those because there's a greater pure joy yet to come. It's about engaging that reality. And the story of the gospel is that Christ has not only enabled us to experience that joy, enable us to live eternally in that joy, but also that he's equipped us to do in serving others similarly. Like Bing Bong giving himself up. Because I look a lot more like Bing Bong than Bing Bong looks like Jesus. I don't do as good a dolphin. It's not just for Joy Bing Bong doesn't give himself up so that Joy can live for herself. What does he say? Take Riley to the moon for me. Take Riley to the moon for me. Take her to the moon for me. I have to guide choke away the tears every time that happens. If someone actually gave themselves up for us in a real narrative outside of this film, if we go home and we believe somebody actually gave themselves up for us, that's how we return and say, who might we help? Who needs help getting to the moon? We could leave the story thinking about our own emotional well-being, or we could leave the inspiration to care for others. Romans 12:2 says, "Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. You may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And that's the final question. How do we get our minds renewed? This is about a renewing mind experience for Riley. How do we get that in our lives? I believe it is very definitely an internal struggle, not exactly like that, although I kind of wish I had those colorful characters running around inside my brain. How do we get our minds renewed? Internal struggle, but also external help. I believe God has made us with amazing, decisive, excellent minds. But the only way we truly get there is by one who is not imaginary, one who doesn't fade. Even if, like Riley has, we've forgotten him. Or just suppressed parts of him. One who calls us to retain a childlike aspect of our faith, and yet one who also calls us to maturity because we need to grow up. God changed me from the inside out, and it's a pleasure to know him. He sent his son, who was obedient to death, to renew me. And so this story reminds me of the perfect story, my story. And that's why it gives me joy. I'll pray, and then we can take a sneak peek at Riley's first date. God, I thank you for some time just to resonate on where we look for joy or how we scramble for it in the wrong ways, into the wrong places. And how it's not that joy is bad, but that we need to understand the complexity of an emotional maturity that I believe you call us to. And so we would ask that you would help us in that as we laugh at some tropes and some character types that we know represent us, and maybe others around us, but if we first focus on us, I know that some of it makes a light and cute mockery of ourselves. Remind us where we need to be conformed more to your image and likeness, where we do need our mind and our heart and our souls renewed, where we do need to lean into your wisdom that actually comes objectively from above and outside, but can actually transform our minds, set those personality islands correctly, and let us walk in a way that is truly beautiful and inspires others, and then gives us opportunities to sacrifice for them. And so thank you for letting us look at this story from the inside out. I pray that helps us to recognize and know you better too. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Without further ado.